My son-in-law Mark saw my home not as a place of love, but as his personal bank, and he was determined to make a withdrawal. For months, he and my own daughter, Laura, chipped away at my boundaries, twisting my love into an obligation, waiting for the moment I would finally break. It all came to a head at what was supposed to be a quiet family dinner, when his frustration finally boiled over and he shouted the words I will never forget. "You're useless here all by yourself," he expected. Tears. He expected me to surrender. But he forgot that for 40 years, my entire profession was built on one simple skill: remembering every single word people wished they could take back. And when I calmly revealed the one secret sentence I had documented a month earlier, the only sound in the room was my daughter's gasp. There is a particular quiet that settles into my house on a Sunday afternoon. It's a peaceful sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It's the sound of a life well lived, of order and calm. For 6 days a week, that quiet is my sanctuary. But on the 7th day, it becomes the silence before the storm. I was in the kitchen, pulling my signature pot roast from the oven, the scent of rosemary and thyme filling the air. This meal was a ritual, a weekly offering of love on a platter. It was my way of holding my small family together. When I heard the sound of their car in the driveway, a familiar tension coiled in my stomach. It was always this way, a flicker of hope that this time would be different, followed by the dull certainty that it would not. I smoothed down my apron and went to the door to greet them. Laura, my daughter, came in first, giving me a quick, distracted hug that smelled of expensive perfume. Mark, my son-in-law, followed behind her, flashing a smile that was wide enough to sell cars, but never quite reached his eyes. He was carrying a bottle of wine, the cheap kind from the grocery store, which he presented to me as if it were a rare vintage. "Beatrice," he said, his voice booming in the quiet entryway. "You've outdone yourself again. Smells incredible." I thanked him and took the bottle. In our unspoken arrangement, he provided the $5 wine and I provided the $50 roast. It was a transaction that perfectly summarized our entire relationship. We settled at the dining room table, the one my late husband David and I had bought at an auction nearly 50 years ago. It was covered in the fine lines and faint scratches of 1,000 happy family meals. But lately, it felt more like a boardroom table where I was perpetually on the defense. For a while, the conversation was light. Mark talked about his golf game. Laura talked about a coworker's drama. He was charming. She was cheerful. It was a well-rehearsed performance. I've been a court stenographer for 40 years. I know a performance when I see one. I know how to listen to the words people aren't saying. And every polite question they asked felt like a reconnaissance mission, mapping out the terrain before the main assault. The attack came, as it always did, between the main course and dessert. Mark pushed his clean plate away, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, and leaned forward, his elbows on my polished table. "So, B," he began, using the nickname I despised. "I've been running some numbers on the new venture. The projections are, well, they're astronomical." Here it was. He launched into a speech filled with jargon and buzzwords, talking about market disruption and scalable solutions. He painted a picture of a future where he was a titan of industry, where all their money worries would vanish. Laura watched him with wide-eyed adoration, nodding at all the right moments. I just listened, letting him lay all his cards on the table. Finally, he got to the point. "The thing is, the bank is ready to play ball. They're on board. But they have this one little hang-up about collateral for a business this new. It's just a formality, really. They just need a co-signer with a little more established credit to get us over the finish line." He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with expectation. Laura's hand found mine across the table, her grip soft and pleading. This was the moment, the reason for the pot roast, the price of admission for their company. I took a slow sip of water, gathering my thoughts. I looked at my daughter, at her hopeful face, and I hated what I had to do next. "Mark," I said, my voice calm and even, "it sounds like a very ambitious plan, but I can't co-sign a loan for that amount. My income is fixed. If the business were to fail, I would lose my home." The warmth in the room evaporated in an instant. It was a look I had seen before, the one that meant I had failed their test of loyalty. Mark's smile became a thin, hard line. Laura's hand slipped away from mine. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. And before I tell you what my own daughter said to me in that crushing silence, I'd love it if you'd let me know where you're watching from today. It's wonderful to know where these stories are heard. Please, take a moment to leave a comment, and if you're enjoying this so far, a like would mean the world to me. Laura was the one who broke the silence. She wouldn't look at me. Instead, she looked at her plate. "I can't believe you won't even consider it, Mom," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But each word was laced with disappointment. "After everything Mark has sacrificed for us, I thought you believed in family." Family. That was the word they always used when they wanted something. It was a key, and they expected it to unlock my home, my savings, my security. Mark pushed his chair back from the table. "Fine," he said, the charm gone, replaced by a cold, dismissive tone. "I guess you just don't believe in me. It's fine." He didn't speak for the rest of the meal. He ate the apple, pie I had made from scratch, in a tense, angry silence. Laura tried to fill the quiet with meaningless chatter, but the damage was done. They left as soon as they could, with a perfunctory goodbye that felt more like a dismissal. As I stood in the kitchen, scraping their plates into the trash, the silence of the house returned. But it wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, lonely. I had protected my home. I had defended my boundary. But as I washed the dishes and put my perfect kitchen back in order, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was simply rearranging furniture in a house that they already saw as their own. I had won the battle over the loan, but I had a sinking feeling I was still losing the war. The week that followed that disastrous Sunday dinner was silent. For the first time in years, Laura didn't call to chat about her day. She didn't text me a funny picture she saw online. It was a calculated silence, a punishment for my refusal to comply. I knew it was orchestrated by Mark. It had his fingerprints all over it. This was his way of showing me that my daughter's affection was conditional, a prize I had to earn by funding their life. I tried to go about my days as usual, tending to my garden and reading in the evenings. But the quiet in the house had become heavy again, thick with unspoken accusations. My peace, or what was left of it, was shattered on Thursday morning while I was paying my bills. I had given Laura a credit card in her name on my account years ago, with the strict understanding that it was for true emergencies only. A flat tire, a medical copay. It was a safety net, and in 5 years she had never used it. But there, on the screen, was a charge from 2 days ago. A charge for over $800 from a boutique downtown, a place that sold $500 handbags and leather jackets. My heart sank. It wasn't about the money. It was the complete and utter disregard for our agreement. It was a secret withdrawal, made in the shadow of that awful dinner. I picked up the phone and dialed her number, my hand trembling slightly. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice wary. "Hi, Mom." "Laura, I'm looking at the credit card statement," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. "There's a charge here from a store called Vivante." There was a pause. "Oh," she said, her voice suddenly small. "Right. I was going to tell you about that. My work bag broke. The strap just snapped. I had to get a new one. A new one. For $800? I asked gently. The defensiveness flared instantly. "Gosh, Mom, I didn't realize you tracked every penny. You know how stressful things have been with Mark's business. I had a huge presentation and I needed to look professional. You wouldn't want me to look unprofessional, would you?" The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. She was twisting my concern into an attack, painting herself as the victim. "The card was for emergencies, Laura," I said, softly. "Well," she snapped, her voice cracking with manufactured indignation. "Maybe this felt like an emergency to me. I can't believe you're giving me a hard time about this. We'll pay you back when Mark's deal comes through." And with that, she hung up. I sat there for a long time, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. She had never spoken to me like that before. It wasn't my daughter's voice on the phone. It was Mark's. He was speaking through her, using her as a mouthpiece for his own entitlement and resentment. 2 days later, they appeared on my doorstep unannounced. Mark was all smiles again, as if the last week had never happened. He said they were on their way to run an errand and their car was making a funny noise. He asked if they could possibly borrow my sedan. "Just for an hour, B. We'll be back before you know it," he promised, dangling my own car keys in front of me, which he'd plucked from the hook by the door. Every instinct told me to say no, but I saw the look on Laura's face, a silent plea for me to just be agreeable, to not start another fight. I was so tired of fighting. I relented and watched them drive away in the car my husband had so proudly bought me just before he passed. An hour turned into the rest of the afternoon. The afternoon turned into evening. They didn't come back. My calls went to voicemail. The next day, Sunday, came and went. They finally returned late Sunday night. The car was filthy, and there was a long, ugly scratch across the passenger side door. The gas tank was on empty. Mark got out, stretching like he'd just returned from a long vacation. "That was a lifesaver, B," he said, tossing me the keys. He gestured to the scratch. "We had a little run-in with a shopping cart. Don't worry, you can barely see it." He said it with a casualness that made my blood run cold. There was no apology, no offer to fix it. My car, my property, was just a disposable convenience to him. Laura looked ashamed, at least. She muttered a quick, "Sorry, Mom," before Mark pulled her toward their own car. As I watched them leave, I felt a profound sense of erasure. It was as if my own needs, my own possessions, my own rules, were completely invisible to them. Their final move of the campaign came the following weekend. They showed up with a pizza, a peace offering. I knew better now. There was always a price. After we ate, Mark started wandering around the house, his hands behind his back like a general surveying his territory. He ended up in the spare bedroom. It's my favorite room in the house. It holds David's old desk and his library of history books. My sewing machine is in the corner, surrounded by projects and fabrics. It's my space. He stood in the doorway, looking in. He didn't speak to me. He spoke to Laura, but his voice was loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen. "You know, honey," he said thoughtfully, "if we cleared out all this old stuff, my desk would fit perfectly under that window. The light in here is fantastic. This would make a great home office." He wasn't asking. He was announcing. He was mentally moving his furniture into my husband's room, into my sanctuary. Laura just stood beside him, silent. She didn't defend the space. She didn't defend me. She just watched as her husband planned his occupation of my home. I stood at the kitchen sink, my hands gripping the porcelain edge, and I finally understood. This wasn't a series of thoughtless acts. The loan, the credit, card, the car, and now this. They were tests. They were incursions, designed to see how far they could push, how much territory I would cede without a fight. And hearing him talk about clearing out my husband's memory like it was just clutter, I felt a cold dread settle deep in my bones. They weren't just asking for a place to stay anymore. They were planning a takeover. After the incident with the spare bedroom, a strange and unsettling shift occurred. Mark and Laura's tactics changed. The passive aggression and entitled demands were replaced by a wave of suffocating sweetness. Laura started calling me every morning just to chat. Mark would show up with my favorite pastries, insisting he was just in the neighborhood. They complimented my garden, my cooking, my clothes. They treated me not as a mother, but as a queen. And it terrified me more than any of their previous anger. It was a siege, but fought with smiles and kind words. They were trying to build a fortress of obligation around me, brick by brick, so that when they made their next request, I would be a prisoner of my own gratitude. I knew they were planning something. The kindness was a Trojan horse, and I was just waiting to see what soldiers would come pouring out. The answer came on a bright Tuesday afternoon. They had come over unannounced as usual, but this time Laura had brought a photo album from her childhood. She sat beside me on the sofa, turning the pages, her voice soft with nostalgia. "Oh, Mom, remember this one?" she'd say, pointing to a picture of a gap-toothed little girl. "Do you have the pictures from that trip we took to the coast? The one where I built that giant sandcastle?" It was a calculated move. "I think I do," I said. "They might be in the chest upstairs in my closet." "Would you mind looking?" she asked, her eyes wide and innocent. "I'd love to show Mark." I knew it was a pretense, a way to get me out of the room. But I played along. I smiled, patted her hand, and went upstairs, my steps feeling heavy. As I opened the old cedar chest, the scent of mothballs and memories filling the air, I heard the faint ring of Mark's cell phone downstairs. I found the packet of old photos and paused, knowing I should just go back down. But a cold knot of dread in my stomach held me back. I waited. After a few minutes, I started back down the stairs. My house has 2 staircases, a formal one in the front and a steep, narrow one that leads down to the back of the living room near the kitchen. I chose the back stairs, wanting to be as quiet as possible. As I reached the bottom step, I froze. The door to the living room was ajar, and I could hear Mark's voice. This was not the charming, affable voice he used for me. This was his real voice, sharp, arrogant, and dripping with contempt. "The bank is a non-issue," he was saying, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Stop worrying about it." There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. Then Mark laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. No, the old woman didn't co-sign. She gave me some sob story about her fixed income. It doesn't matter. Plan B is already in motion. Laura is working on her right now, actually. All that remember when nonsense. She's softening her up. My hand flew to my mouth. I felt the blood drain from my face. I was leaning against the wall, the old photographs clutched in my hand, the edges digging into my palm. "The goal," Mark continued, his voice dropping even lower, "is to get her to add my name to the house deed. For estate planning purposes, you know, for her own safety. Laura is convincing her it's the responsible thing to do. The minute that ink is dry, we can leverage the house for everything we need. The equity in this place is insane." Another pause. My heart was hammering so loudly I was sure he would hear it. Then came the words that would be seared into my memory forever. "What's she going to do with it anyway?" Mark scoffed. "She just sits on a gold mine. The old woman is useless otherwise." Useless. The word hit me with the force of a physical blow. It knocked the air from my lungs. All the years of love, of support, of sacrifice. Every meal I had cooked, every tear I had dried, every dollar I had given. All of it, erased. I was not a mother. I was not a person. I was a stubborn lock on a treasure chest, and he was tired of waiting for the key. I was a useless old woman sitting on his gold mine. I didn't know how long. I stood there, hidden in the shadows of the hallway. It could have been seconds or minutes. I heard him wrap up the call. Yeah. It's a sure thing. I'll talk to you later." I backed away, my steps silent on the old wood floors. I retreated up the stairs, my own home suddenly feeling like enemy territory. I sat on my bed, the room spinning around me. The betrayal was so absolute, so profound. It was almost elegant in its cruelty. It wasn't just about the money or the house. It was a complete negation of my life, my worth. Downstairs, I heard Laura's cheerful voice call up, "Mom, did you find them?" I took a deep, shuddering breath. I had to answer. I had to sound normal. I cleared my throat, praying my voice wouldn't betray me. "Yes, dear," I called back. "I found them. I'll be right down." As I stood up and looked at my reflection in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. The soft, patient mother was gone. In her place was someone I hadn't seen in a very long time. The pain in my chest wasn't breaking me. It was forging me into something new, something harder, something colder. They thought I was useless. They had no idea what a useless old woman could do. I walked back down the stairs, each step a triumph of will. The packet of old photographs felt like a prop in a play I never auditioned for. I handed them to Laura, my hand steady, my expression a carefully constructed mask of pleasant nostalgia. For the next 20 minutes, I sat on the sofa, between my daughter and her husband, the man who had just declared me useless, and I listened to them lie. Laura would point to a photo. "Oh, look, Mark, this is Mom teaching me to ride my bike. She ran behind me for hours until I got it." She would smile at me, a bright, false smile, and I would smile back, while Mark's words echoed in my head. Mark would chuckle and say, "You were a great mom, Beatrice. Still are." He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate, but it felt like he was staking a claim. His touch made my skin crawl, and I would nod, a gracious, silent queen accepting the flattery of a traitor, while the truth screamed in my mind. Looking at my daughter, the real one, the little girl with scraped knees and a trusting smile in the faded photographs, my heart didn't just break. It splintered. It turned to dust. Because that little girl was gone. In her place was a stranger, a co-conspirator who saw my love not as a gift, but as a resource to be exploited, a gold mine. The effort it took to sit there, to nod, to smile, to play my part as the doting, slightly naive matriarch was the hardest work I have ever done. It was more difficult than any complex testimony I ever had to transcribe, more taxing than any 12-hour day in a courtroom. When they finally stood to leave, Laura gave me a hug, her cheek soft against mine. "Thanks for this, Mom," she whispered. "This was so nice." It was a perfect performance of filial devotion. I just nodded. I couldn't trust myself to speak. I watched from the window as their car pulled away, and the moment it disappeared around the corner, the mask crumbled. My smile vanished. The strength in my spine, the one that had held me upright through their charade, seemed to dissolve. I walked over to my husband's old armchair, the worn leather sighing as I sank into it, and I waited. I waited for the tears. I waited for the rage, for the impulse to throw something, to scream at, the empty, silent walls. But nothing happened. There was only a profound, echoing quiet, both inside the house and inside of me. The shock was so deep it was paralyzing. Useless. The word kept turning over in my mind. A smooth, poisoned stone. I thought of the life I had built in this house, the nights I had stayed up with a sick child, the thousands of meals I had cooked, the garden I had cultivated from a patch of weeds into a vibrant sanctuary. I thought of my career, 40 years of sitting, in silence, listening to victims, to criminals, to lawyers, to judges. My entire life had been about service, about paying attention, about being useful. My job was to be the keeper of the truth, to ensure that what was said was never lost. My skill was not in speaking, but in hearing everything, in remembering. And as I sat there, in the deepening twilight, the splinters of my broken heart began to shift. The pain wasn't dulling. It was sharpening. It was changing shape. The soft, agonizing grief crystallizing into something else. Something hard. Something cold. Something focused. They had made a fatal error. Their mistake was not in their greed. It was in their assessment of their target. They looked at me and saw a soft, sentimental old woman. They saw a liability, a mark. They never once thought to look at my hands, at the faint calluses from decades of typing at 200 words a minute. They never considered what a mind trained to absorb and retain every detail, every lie, every subtle confession was capable of. They had declared me useless. But a court stenographer is never useless. A court stenographer is the most dangerous person in the room. She is the one who holds the record. She is the one who knows exactly what you said, when you said it, and the context in which you said it. Liars and cheats live in a world of shifting stories and convenient half-truths. I lived in a world of verbatim transcripts. A quiet resolve settled over me. It was not born of anger or a desire for revenge. It was simpler than that. It was the calm, methodical focus of a professional preparing for a difficult case. My daughter and her husband had presented their testimony through their actions and their secret whispered words. Now, it was time to prepare the evidence for the court. The tears never came. Tears were an indulgence, a waste of energy. That night, I didn't mourn the family I had lost. I began to meticulously plan how to deal with the two strangers who were trying to take its place. The game was no longer about love and loyalty. It was about facts and evidence. My home was now a courtroom, and court was officially in session. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The house was still and dark, but for the first time in months, the quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt purposeful. The grief and shock from the night before had been burned away, leaving behind the cold, clean ash of resolve. I made my coffee, my movements precise and deliberate, and sat down at my husband's old oak desk before the first birds began to sing. The time for feeling was over. It was time for work. I powered on my computer and created a new file, protecting it with a password David and I had created years ago, an inside joke from a vacation we took in the 70s. No one else in the world would know it. I named the file simply Ledger. Then I began to write. My mind, for so long a vessel of painful memories, became a professional instrument once again. A court stenographer's memory is a unique thing. You learn to anchor words to moments. You don't just remember the sentence. You remember the nervous tap of a lawyer's pen, the flicker of a fluorescent light, the exact moment a witness's voice began to break. So, I went back. I started with the disastrous Sunday dinner. I transcribed Mark's pitch for the loan and my exact words of refusal. I noted the date, the time, and the immediate, chilling shift in his demeanor. Then, I moved forward. The $800 handbag. I documented the date of the charge, and my subsequent phone call with Laura. I typed out her flimsy excuses and her final, cutting words before she hung up. It was all there, verbatim. The unreturned $500. The weekend they stole my car, complete with the cost estimate I had quietly gotten for the scratch on the door. Every dismissive comment, every entitled demand. Each entry was dated, timed, and emotionless. It was a catalog of their campaign of disrespect, a factual record of their mounting greed. After 3 hours of steady, focused work, the sun was streaming through my window. The ledger was a damning document, a testament to 1,000 small cuts. But it was all in the past. I knew I needed to prepare for the future. They were planning to ask me to sign over my deed, and I needed to know exactly what I was up against. There was only one person I trusted enough to ask. I picked up the phone and called Arthur, my husband's best friend and a retired probate lawyer. His voice was warm and familiar, a welcome sound from a kinder, more honest time. I framed my questions carefully. I didn't want to alarm him, and I certainly didn't want to confess the full, ugly truth about my daughter. Not yet. Arthur, I began, I've been thinking about updating my will, just getting my affairs in order. I have a hypothetical question for you. For you, Beatrice, my time is never hypothetical, he said kindly. I was wondering about property deeds, I said, keeping my voice steady. What are the legal dangers of adding a family member to the deed of a primary residence while the owner is still alive? Arthur was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his friendly tone was gone, replaced by the sharp focus of a lawyer. Beatrice, my advice is simple. Don't do it. The moment another name is on that deed, especially a name that isn't a spouse, you are vulnerable. They could use the house as collateral. They could force a sale. It exposes your single greatest asset to their debts, their divorces, their disasters. Why are you asking? Just future planning, I lied smoothly, making sure all my protections are in place. Well, the best protection is a solid will and a living trust, he advised. But above all, if you ever feel pressured, remember this. Documentation is a fortress. A clear, dated record of any conversation, any request, any transaction. That is what stands up in court. A person's, memory can be questioned. A detailed log cannot. His words were a powerful confirmation. My instincts had been right. When I hung up the phone, I knew what my next step had to be. My ledger of past events was strong, but I needed evidence of their future plans, in their own words. That afternoon, I went to an electronics store. I felt a pang of shame as I stood in the aisle, looking at tiny, discreet recording devices. This was something out of a spy movie, not the life of a 68-year-old retiree. It felt sordid and dishonest. But then I remembered Mark's voice on the phone, the casual cruelty of it. This was not an act of aggression. It was an act of self-defense. I was not spying. I was taking minutes. I bought the smallest, most powerful one they had. It was voice-activated and could hold hundreds of hours of recordings. Back home, I placed it on the bookshelf in the living room, tucked behind a row of David's thick history books. It was invisible, but it was listening. For the next week, I lived a double life. On the surface, I was the same Beatrice. I answered Laura's overly sweet phone calls. I politely declined Mark's invitations to lunch, citing a busy schedule. I played my part, the gentle, slightly dotty old woman they thought I was. But beneath the surface, I was a strategist. Every night, I would add to my ledger. Every morning, I would check the recording device. The trap was set. The evidence file on my computer grew day by day. Arthur's legal advice was clear in my mind. All that was left was for them to make their final move. All I had to do was wait for them to walk into the one place a liar is most vulnerable. A room where someone is keeping a perfect transcript. And as the days ticked by, I had a growing certainty that I wouldn't have to wait very long at all. The waiting was the hardest part. For 10 days, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I tended my garden, I read my books, I answered Laura's cloying, cheerful phone calls. Each day was a performance, and I was growing tired of my role. I knew they were letting me simmer, letting the silence and the fake kindness work on my conscience. They were waiting for me to be lonely enough, to be desperate enough for their affection, that I would agree to anything. I knew the call was coming. I just didn't know when. It came on a Thursday morning. The phone rang, and I saw Laura's name on the screen. I took a deep breath, pressed the record button on the small device, connected to my landline, and answered. "Mom?" Her voice was a choked sob. It was a masterful performance. "Laura, what is it? What's wrong?" I asked, my own voice a perfect imitation of a concerned mother. "It's Mark," she wailed. "His investor pulled out. The whole deal fell apart. We lost everything, Mom. The landlord just served us eviction papers. We have to be out by the end of the month. We have nowhere to go." The practiced hysteria, the carefully timed sobs, it was all there. I listened patiently, making the appropriate sympathetic noises. I let her cry for what felt like an eternity, knowing she was just building up to the real purpose of the call. Finally, it came. "Mom, please," she begged, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Can we just stay with you for a little while, just until we get back on our feet?" I was silent for a moment, letting her hang in the space she had created. "And Mark and I were talking," she continued, rushing the words out now. He said that to protect the family, and to make sure we feel secure, that maybe you should add him to the deed of the house." There it was, the final move, the checkmate they had been planning all along. She finally said the words her husband had coached her to say, the true reason for this entire, elaborate performance. And before I tell you my response, the simple sentence that changed the entire game, I want to say thank you for being on this journey with me. If you are finding strength in this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world and helps ensure more stories like this can be told. I let the silence stretch for another few seconds. I wanted her to feel the weight of her own words, of the monumental thing she had just asked of me. I could hear her ragged breathing on the other end of the line. She was expecting me to argue, to cry, to refuse. She was expecting a fight. I gave her none of it. When I finally spoke, my voice was perfectly calm, almost serene. "Laura," I said, "you and Mark will come for dinner this Sunday. We will settle everything then." The silence on her end was now one of pure confusion. I had not followed her script. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she tried to process my response. "Settle everything?" she repeated. "Yes," I said. "Everything. I'll make my pot roast. We'll sit down as a family and we will find a final resolution. I'll see you at 6. Before she could ask another question, I hung up. I had seized control. The confrontation would not happen on their terms, in a moment of manufactured crisis. It would happen on my turf, at my table, on my schedule. They would spend the next 3 days believing they had won. They would walk into my home on Sunday, not as desperate supplicants, but as victors ready to claim their prize. And in doing so, they would walk directly into my trap. The next 3 days were a blur of methodical preparation. I went to my desk and opened the ledger file. I printed every page, the stack of paper growing thicker than I had anticipated. It was a heavy, damning document, a physical manifestation of their lies. I 3-hole punched the pages and placed them in a simple, professional-looking binder. Next, I retrieved the small recording device from the living room bookshelf. I sat at my desk with a pair of headphones, my old stenographer's foot pedal on the floor out of habit. I listened to Mark's voice, cold and clear, boasting about his plan. Hearing it again didn't cause me any pain. It was just data now, evidence. I transcribed the conversation, word for word, and printed it on a single sheet of paper, which I placed at the very front of the binder. Finally, I called Arthur. "One last hypothetical, Arthur," I said. "Is a conversation recorded in one's own home, where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy for the other party, admissible as evidence in a civil proceeding in Oregon?" He chuckled. "Beatrice, what have you gotten yourself into? Generally speaking, Oregon is a one-party consent state. As long as one person in the conversation knows it's being recorded, you're on solid legal ground. Why do you ask?" "Just tying up loose ends," I said. "Thank you, Arthur. You've been a great help." On Sunday afternoon, my preparations were complete. The binder sat on the sideboard in the dining room, looking as innocuous as a photo album. The house was filled with the warm, comforting scent of pot roast, the same meal I had served them weeks ago. But this time, it smelled like victory. The table was set for 3, with my best linen and the silverware David and I had received as a wedding gift. Everything was in its place. Everything was ready. The performance was over. A verdict was about to be rendered. At precisely 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I smoothed my apron, took one last look at the binder on the sideboard, and walked to the door. My heart was not racing. My hands were not trembling. I felt a profound and unnerving calm, the kind a captain must feel when they have steered their ship through a storm and are finally entering the quiet, deep waters of the harbor. I opened the door. They stood on my porch, wreathed in the golden light of the setting sun. But they did not look like people on the brink of eviction. They looked like royalty arriving to claim their new kingdom. Laura was beaming, her face flushed with relief. Mark stood beside her, his arm draped possessively around her shoulders, a look of supreme satisfaction on his face. He had the smug expression of a gambler who had just played his last card and won the entire pot. "Beatrice," he said, his voice smooth as silk. He leaned in and gave me a theatrical hug, whispering in my ear, "You made the right choice. You won't regret this." I didn't answer. I simply stepped back and welcomed them into my home, for what I knew would be the last time. I had expected them to be on their best behavior, to maintain the pretense of desperation for a little while longer. I was wrong. The moment the door closed behind them, Mark dropped all pretense. He was not a guest in my home. He was the new owner, conducting his first inspection. He walked into the living room, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning everything, not with appreciation, but with cold assessment. "We'll get rid of this wallpaper first thing," he announced to Laura, who followed him like a loyal lady in waiting. "Too dated. We'll open it all up. Paint everything a clean white. More of a minimalist aesthetic, you know?" He ran his hand over my velvet armchair, the one David used to sit in. "This has to go," he said with a little sniff of disdain. "All of this dark, heavy furniture, it just sucks the life out of the room." I stood by the doorway, a silent witness to the dismantling of my life. I didn't say a word. I just watched, and I listened. Every arrogant pronouncement, every dismissive gesture was just another line in the closing argument I was preparing in my mind. Laura, completely swept up in his vision, chimed in. Oh, and the kitchen, honey. We could knock out that wall and put in a huge island, with marble countertops. Exactly, Mark said, pointing a finger at her as if she'd had a brilliant idea. This place has good bones, but it has no vision. We'll give it vision. He then strode over to the spare bedroom, to my husband's library, to my sanctuary. He didn't even hesitate. He walked right in, Laura trailing behind him. And this, he said, his voice echoing from the room, is my new office. I told you the light was perfect. We'll have custom bookshelves built in, floor to ceiling. It'll be a real command center. He was erasing my husband. He was erasing me. And my own daughter was standing right there, nodding and smiling, helping him hold the eraser. She saw a marble island. He saw a command center. Neither of them saw me at all. They were so blinded by their greed, so sure of their victory, that they didn't even notice the look on my face. They didn't see the quiet, watchful stillness. They just saw the useless old woman, the obstacle that had finally, thankfully, crumbled. After they had redesigned my entire home to their satisfaction, I finally spoke. The roast is ready, I said, my voice startling them a little. Why don't we sit down to eat? Fantastic, Mark boomed, rubbing his hands together. All this planning has made me hungry. We moved into the dining room. I brought out the heavy platter, the steam rising from the perfectly browned roast. It was the picture of a happy family dinner. The same table, the same food, the same people as that Sunday weeks ago. But everything had changed. The power had shifted, silently, irrevocably. They just didn't know it yet. I placed the platter in the center of the table. Mark, taking his seat at the head of the table, my husband's seat, picked up his wine glass. He held it aloft, a triumphant, smug grin spreading across his face. A toast, he announced, looking first at a beaming Laura and then at me, to family and to new beginnings. I met his gaze across the table. I looked at his smiling, arrogant face, and then I let my eyes drift for just a second to the simple white binder sitting on the sideboard. Yes, I said, my voice perfectly even. To new beginnings. I picked up my own glass, a silent promise to myself hanging in the air. You have no idea. We began to eat. Or rather, they began to eat. I merely moved the food around on my plate. I watched Mark, who ate with a hurried, proprietary air, as if this was already his table, his food, his house. He was talking nonstop, laying out his grand plans for the future, a future built on the foundation of my life's work. Laura, caught up in his enthusiasm, was laughing, adding details, completely oblivious to the fact that she was dining on the edge of a cliff. I let them talk. The more they spoke, the more they condemned themselves. After a few minutes, Mark's patience, a resource he had in very short supply, finally ran out. He put his fork and knife down with a loud clatter that made Laura jump. Look, Beatrice, he said, his charming host persona vanishing completely. He leaned forward, his expression all business now. This has been lovely, really, but let's just get to it. We need to talk logistics. I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork to add me to the deed tomorrow. We'll just need you to sign. He said it so casually, as if asking for a second helping of potatoes. I simply looked at him. I didn't speak. My silence seemed to infuriate him. What? He said, his voice rising. What's that look for? This is a win-win. We get the capital we need. You get to have family here to look after you. Frankly, you're useless here all by yourself, rattling around in this big house. My ambition, my vision, can make this place work for all of us. It's the smart thing to do. Useless. He had said it again. Not in a secret, whispered phone call, but directly to my face, across my own dinner table. It was the final nail in a coffin he had been building for months. He expected me to be intimidated, to be hurt, to finally give in. But I felt nothing. No pain, no anger, only a quiet, final clarity. I turned my head slowly, deliberately, away from him. I looked directly at my daughter. She was watching me, a nervous, pleading look in her eyes, silently begging me to just agree, to keep the peace. "Laura," I said, and my voice was so calm, so steady, it seemed to surprise them both. "Before I answer your husband, I have a question for you." I paused, letting the moment hang in the air. "Did you know," I continued, my voice as clear and precise as a court record, "that on the afternoon of Tuesday, July 28th, at approximately 2:15, your husband was on the phone with his business partner, telling him that his plan B was to get his name on my house deed so he could leverage it for his own personal debts?" The color drained from Laura's face. Her jaw dropped. A small, horrified gasp escaped her lips. She stared at me, then her head whipped around to look at Mark. "What?" she whispered. "What is she talking about?" Mark scoffed, trying to recover. He forced a laugh, but it sounded like breaking glass. "She's confused, honey. She's an old woman. She must have misheard something." "Oh, I heard it perfectly," I said, my gaze still locked on my daughter. "He also said you were softening me up, and he referred to me as the old woman who is useless otherwise." Laura looked like she had been slapped. She recoiled from Mark, a look of dawning horror on her face. Mark started to bluster, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is ridiculous. You're putting words in my mouth. You're a liar." He started to deny it all, of course, to call me confused, to call me a liar. But I knew this moment was coming. I had prepared for it. And as I stood up from my chair to retrieve the proof, I want to take a moment to ask for your support. If this story resonates with you, and you believe in the power of quiet strength, please take a second to click the like button. It tells me that stories about finding your voice truly matter. I walked to the sideboard, my movements unhurried. I picked up the simple white binder. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with the weight of their deceit. I walked back to the table and placed it on the polished wood between them. The sound it made in the silent room was soft, but it had the finality of a judge's gavel. Mark stared at the binder as if it were a snake. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice strained. Laura couldn't speak. She was just staring at the plain white cover, her hand trembling as it hovered over her mouth. I sat back down in my chair, the rightful head of my own table. "Everything is in there," I said, my voice as calm as a summer evening. "It's a ledger, a record of every financial request, every unpaid loan, every broken promise going back 2 years. And at the very front, you will find a complete word-for-word transcript of your phone call from July 28th. I looked at them, at their shocked, pale faces. "I suggest you take a look." The silence that fell over the dinner table was absolute. It was heavier than any argument, more final than any slammed door. The scent of the cooling pot roast seemed to mock the scene, a ghost of a family meal that never was. Mark was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Laura, however, seemed to be in a trance, her eyes fixed on the white binder as if it held the answer to a question she had been too afraid to ask for years. Her hand, trembling, reached out and slowly opened the cover. Her eyes scanned the first page, the word-for-word transcript of Mark's phone call. I watched her face as she read. I saw the flicker of confusion, then the dawning of a horrible understanding, and finally, the quiet, complete devastation as she absorbed the truth of his contempt. Her shoulders slumped. The light in her eyes, the one that had been so bright with manufactured hope just minutes before, went out. "Don't be ridiculous, Laura," Mark hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "Don't you see what she's doing? She's trying to manipulate you, to turn you against me. It's a pathetic fantasy she's cooked up because she's a bitter, lonely old woman." Laura didn't even look at him. She slowly turned the page, and then another, and another. She was reading the ledger. She saw the $800 handbag. She saw the $500 for a car repair that became a weekend getaway. She saw the estimated cost to fix the scratch on my car door. She saw a meticulous, dated, undeniable pattern of lies, entitlement, and exploitation. When she finally looked up, her gaze was not on me. It was on her husband. Her voice was quiet, brittle, like a piece of glass about to shatter. "You called her useless? she asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact she was trying to comprehend. It's not what it sounds like, Mark stammered, his arrogance finally cracking, revealing the panicked child beneath. I was just talking big for my partner. You know how it is. I was doing it for us. For us? Laura's voice gained a sliver of strength. Was stealing from my mother's credit card for us? Was treating her car like a rental for us? Was this your plan all along, Mark? To bleed her dry and then take her home? I was building a future, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table, rattling the plates. Something she was never willing to help us with. I did what I had to do. What you had to do, she repeated, her voice numb, was lie to me and use me to hurt my own mother. Their entire relationship, their carefully constructed world, was imploding right in front of me. I remained silent. I didn't need to say a word. The truth, in black and white, was doing all the work for me. They argued, their voices rising and falling, a toxic symphony of his justifications and her heartbroken accusations. But his power over her was gone. The binder on the table was like a third person in their marriage, an impartial witness that proved he was a liar and a fraud. Finally, the argument collapsed under its own weight, leaving only the wreckage of their marriage in an exhausted, bitter silence. Mark slumped in his chair, defeated. Laura was crying now, silent tears, tracking down her pale cheeks. That was when I moved. I reached beside me and picked up 2 documents I had placed on an empty chair. I slid them across the table. They stopped next to the binder. Mark and Laura both stared at the papers. What's this? Mark asked, his voice sullen. The first document, I said, my tone calm and clear, is a formal repayment contract. It is for the total sum of $15,780.32, the amount you have borrowed, charged, and failed to repay over the last 26 months. It includes the damage to my car. I will expect the first payment at the beginning of next month. I paused, then pointed to the second document. And that, I said, is a copy of a legally prepared no-contact agreement. Specifically, it states that you will not contact me for any financial reason, ever again. If you violate it, if you ask me for a single dollar, if you harass me in any way, I will have it formally filed. With the court as a restraining order. Mark stared at me, his mouth agape. He was speechless. All of his charisma, all of his schemes had been reduced to a legally binding debt and the threat of a restraining order. I stood up. Dinner is over, I said. I think it's time for you both to leave. Mark was the first to move. He shot up from his chair so violently it almost tipped over. He didn't look at me, didn't look at Laura. He just stormed out of the dining room and out the front door, slamming it so hard the windows rattled. Laura remained seated for a moment longer. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a universe of shame and regret. "Mom?" she began, her voice breaking. "Go home, Laura," I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm. "Just go." She nodded, wiped her eyes, and slowly stood up. She walked out of my house, not as the smug co-conspirator who had arrived an hour earlier, but as a broken woman walking into a future she had not planned for. I heard her car start, then pull away. And then there was silence. I stood alone in my dining room amidst the ruins of their greed. I looked at the half-eaten meal, at the empty chairs. I walked to the front door, and for the first time in a very long time, I turned the deadbolt. A profound sense of peace washed over me. The war was over, and my quiet, orderly, and beautiful home was finally, completely, my own. The silence in my house is different now. For months, it was a heavy, anxious thing, a quiet, filled with unspoken resentments and the dread of the next confrontation. Now, it is light. It is peaceful. It is the sound of my own thoughts, the gentle rustle of pages as I read, the happy bubbling of a kettle on the stove. The quiet is my sanctuary again. It is the sound of freedom. The months that followed that final, terrible dinner were a time of rediscovery. I pulled my old sewing machine out of the corner of the spare room, David's room, and I started quilting again. the vibrant colors, and intricate patterns felt like I was stitching my own life back together, piece by piece. I spent hours in my garden, my hands in the rich soil, coaxing new life from the earth. My roses have never been more beautiful. I reconnected with old friends, including Arthur, who now joins me for coffee every Tuesday morning. We sit on my patio and talk for hours, our laughter filling the space that was once choked with tension. My home, the one Mark had been so eager to strip down and rebuild in his own image, felt more mine than ever. Every piece of dark, heavy furniture he had despised, every old photograph he had wanted to clear away, was a part of my story. It was not a gold mine of equity. It was a library of a life well lived, and I was its proud and sole curator. About 2 months ago, a letter arrived. It was in Laura's handwriting. I opened it with a sense of caution, not knowing what to expect. Inside was a short, simple note. It said, "Mom, I am so sorry. For everything." Tucked. Inside, the card was a check for $200, the first installment of the $15,000 she owed me. There was a postscript at the bottom. It read, "Mark left. He moved to another state. I don't know where he is, and I don't want to." A week later, she called. Her voice was different. The false cheerfulness was gone. The manipulative edge was gone. She sounded tired, but she also sounded real. She told me she had found a small apartment and was working 2 jobs. She didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't make excuses. She just told me the facts of her new life, a life of consequences. We don't talk every day. Our relationship is not what it once was, and perhaps it never will be. The easy, unconditional love of a mother for her child has been replaced by something more careful, more deliberate. But it is honest. For the first time in years, it is finally, completely honest. It is a new beginning, built not on obligation, but on a foundation of difficult, painful, and necessary truth. I often sit in David's armchair in the evenings, the one Mark had so casually dismissed. I look around at this house that I fought for, not with anger and shouting, but with memory and resolve, and I think about that word Mark used, useless. He meant it as an insult, the ultimate dismissal of my worth. But in the end, it was a gift. It was the catalyst that forced me to remember my own value. My strength was never in my bank account or the deed to my house. It was in my mind, in my memory, in the quiet, unshakable knowledge of who I am. They thought my silence was weakness, but it was just me listening. They thought my patience was passivity, but it was just me gathering evidence. And if you have ever been made to feel small, to feel invisible or useless in your own life, I want you to know that your quiet strength is a superpower. Today, my peace is my greatest wealth, and this community we are building here, with every story we share, is a part of that. Each time you subscribe to this channel, you are casting a vote of support, a message that says these stories matter, that our voices deserve to be heard. Please, help this community of strong, resilient voices grow even stronger. The world will tell you that you are past your prime, that your thoughts don't matter, that you are just an obstacle in the way of someone else's ambition. Do not believe it. Never be afraid to set a boundary. Never be afraid to demand the respect you have earned. And above all, never ever forget that true love does not use you. It values you.